to the Polish culture. Let me start from my adolescence when I discovered classical music through Chopin, an artist which I continue to love all along my adult life. And so I was so happy yesterday to visit his native place. As far as the writers are concerned, even I probably read at the age of 12 Quo Vadis. I want only to quote two authors that I loved very much. One is Stanislav Jesse Letts, whom as an editor I made translated into Italian with a preface. And I consider Letts a genius. And compared to him, Karl Kraus was a writer for Chinese cookies. The other is Wisława Szymborska, whom I ventured to meet only 1 year before her death, and with whom, even if we had never met before, immediately occurred such a mutual human sympathy that, by joking, we said that if we had the chance to meet when we were younger, then we would have had a love affair. Having written a book on the search for a perfect language, I even studied Zamenhof, Esperanto, and in the course of my philosophical studies, I tried to approach the logical researches of Audiukiewicz, Tarski, whom I made translator in the philosophical series I directed, Kotarbinsky, not to quote my friend Jesse Peltz. Having largely written on aesthetics, I was enriched by the books of Roman Ingarden. And as far as my studies of medieval aesthetics are concerned, let me also quote not only Władysław Tatarkiewicz, but also a remote author such as Vitello, a forerunner in the 13th century of the modern optics. Then I must cite Adam Schaff, and I was in friendly relation with Stefan Moravsky and Leslie Kolakowski. And recently, I feel very much indebted with Zygmunt Bauman, of which I share many of his lucid opinions about present society. Since I was also concerned with many eccentric characters, I also discovered that forgotten fellow who was Joseph Hurley Wronski. I have all his works in my rare books collection called Biblioteca Semiologica Curiosa, Lunatica, Magica e Pneumatica. And even Wronski can be listed among the category of the fou littéraire. Let me remember that certain of his ideas deserves some lines of appreciation by Roman Jakobson. Finally, in 1996, I was appointed as a doctor honoris causa by the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw, where it was still alive, another of my best Polish friends, Bronislaw Geremek. I am not drawing a profile of the Polish culture, obviously, but only remembering certain encounters that have been important for my scholarly life and which stress some of the links between me and this country. Let me now come to the subject matter of my opening speech, dealing with the past and the future of semiotics. In doing so, I am obliged to return to Poland because it is in this country that the program for an international association of semiotic studies was designed. The idea of an international association of scholars interested in semiotics began to be anticipated during an initial encounter in Kazimierz in 1966, which followed a more informal meeting in Warsaw. Then, in 1968, a second meeting was held in Warsaw. Unfortunately, a few days before, there was the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia, and it was difficult for many scholars to reach Poland. The day of the invasion, I was in Prague, just on the way to Warsaw, And I succeeded in abandoning this country with my car, and I arrived in Vienna, and from there, flying upon the Baltic Sea in order to avoid the Czech skies, we arrived in Warsaw, in a moment that was politically difficult even in this country. On the grounds of the discussions held in Warsaw, it was decided to meet later in '69 in Paris, when various scholars, including Roman Jakobson, Emile Benveniste, Roland Barthes, Julia Kristeva, Thomas Semiotic, Jesse Pels, and Algirdas Greimas, decided to found the International Association for Semiotic Studies. On that occasion, it was decided to adopt the term semiotics, used by Peirce, Russian, and English-speaking authors like Morris, for example, in preference to the term semiology, which was widespread in other linguistic areas. The decision was taken for empirical reasons, in the sense that we wanted to avoid many subtle distinctions then current in various circles, as, for example, the use of semiology for studies deriving from structural linguistics and semiotics for those of a more philosophical nature. And the intention was to establish the idea that a single term could define various types of approach to the world of science. But the choice of semiotics, as supported by Jakobson, also aimed at establishing the notion that the field of study concerning the sign went beyond linguistics. After the meeting in Paris, there was another in Parma in 1971, in which Cesare Segre was appointed as president of the association, while I became the secretary general. And so Segre and we began to organize the first international congress. The preparation took 4 years, and we thought we had contacted at least 200 scholars who had shown an interest in semiotics, but at the opening of the Congress, 800 people showed up. After a general section that opened with the seminal coup d'œil sur le développement de la sémiotique by Roman Jakobson, there was a philosophical section devoted to foundations, one of the relationships between linguistics and semiotics, and then came section on formalized languages, semantics and pragmatics, the semiotics of literature, iconism and visual arts, theater, cinema, architecture, television, and music, a section devoted to the semiotics of culture, one on non-verbal behavior, and one on psychology and psychiatry. It was a vast panorama, but it was a question of seeing whether apparently different problems could be tackled using the same instruments. It was on that occasion that I began to think about the difference between a general semiotics and the various specific semiotics. The result of these reflections appeared in a definite form in '84 in my Semiotics and the Philosophy of Language. A specific semiotics is, or aims at being, the grammar of a particular science system and proves to be successful insofar as it describes a given field of communicative phenomena as ruled by a system of signification. Thus, there are grammars of American Sign Language, of traffic signals of a particular game, poker, for instance. These systems can be studied from a syntactic, semantic, or pragmatic point of view. A specific semiotics can aspire to a scientific status since it studies phenomena that are usually stable, even though a code for traffic signals can have a shorter life than a phonological system, or vice versa. And lexical systems are in a continuous process of transformation. Being scientific, a specific semiotics can have a predictive power. It can tell which expressions produced according to the rules of a given system of signification are acceptable or grammatical, and which ones a user of the system would presumably produce in a given situation. Not every specific semiotics can claim to be like a natural science. However, when cultural anthropology, for instance, studies the kinship system in a certain society, it works upon a rather stable field of phenomena, can produce a theoretical object, can make some prediction about the behavior of the members of this society. The same happens with the lexical analysis of the system of terms expressing kinship relationships in the same society. All around this area of more or less established and rigorous grammatical knowledge, there is barely definable twilight zone of semiotically oriented practice, such as the application of semiotic notion to literary criticism or the analysis of political discourse. The task and the nature of a general semiotics are different. To outline a project for a general semiotics is not sufficient to assert, as Saussure did, that language is a system comparable to writing, symbolic rites, deaf, mute, alphabets, military signals, and so on. In order to conceive of such an endeavor, one must say in which sense these different systems are mutually comparable, whether they are all systems in the same sense of the word system, and whether the mutual comparison of these systems can therefore reveal common systematic laws capable of explaining from a unified point of view their way of functioning. I think that such a discipline cannot be a science in the same sense as physics or electronics. If there is something that deserves the name of general semiotics, this something is a discourse dealing with the above question, and such a discourse is a philosophical one. In any case, it encounters the problems raised by the philosophy of language, because in order to answer the above questions, it is obliged to reconsider from a general and not merely linguistic point of view classical issues such as meaning, reference, truth, context, and communication acts, be they vocal or not, as well as such logical problems as analytic versus synthetic, necessity, implication, entailment, inference, hypothesis, and so on. According to many classical approaches, from the Stoics through Augustine and from Locke to Jacobson, a general semiotics is concerned with the concept of sign as a phenomenon of referral or standing for, aliquid stat pro aliquo. One may decide that the theoretical object of semiotics can be a different and more fruitful one, let's say texts, semiosis, significant practice, communication, language, affability, and so on. But the real problem is not so much which object has to be appointed as the central one. The problem is to decide whether there is a unified object or not. Now, this object can become the central object of a general semiotics insofar as one decides that such a category can explain a series of human and maybe animal behaviors, be they vocal, visual, thermal, gestural, or other. In this sense, the first question of a general semiotics is close to the capital question of any philosophy of language. What does it mean for human beings to speak, to express meanings, to convey ideas, or to mention states of the world? But what means do people, by what means do people perform these tasks? Only by words? And if not, what is there in common between verbal activity and other signifying activities? I thought that the general semiotics improves some of the traditional approaches of the philosophy of language, but it assumes that it is impossible to speak about verbal language without comparing it to other forms of signification and communication. In this sense, general semiotics is fundamentally comparative in its approach. But it is enough to think, for instance, of Wittgenstein, or Husserl, or of Cassirer, to realize that the good philosophy of language necessarily takes this stance. In these early years, semiotics assumed that if comparison is possible between different ways of signifying, these ways should be described as systems. And at that time, the research was dominated by the notion of code. Later, I and others abandoned the idea of a rigid system, if not for some limited and local representation, and I adopted in exchange the notion of a cyclopedia, structured as a network. But this is another story which concerns my personal research. A general semiotics is influenced more than any philosophy of language by the experiences of specific semiotics. Not every philosopher of language would agree with such a project. Many of them assume that the categories provided in order to explain verbal language cannot hold when applied to other alleged phenomena of signification. Concerning this, let me quote a discussion which I had in the 70s with Gilbert Harman during a Christian Gauss seminar at Princeton. Harman wrote in Semiotics and Cinema, smoke means fire, and the word combustion means fire, but not in the same sense of means. The word means is ambiguous. To say that smoke means fire is to say that smoke is a symptom, sign, indication, or evidence for fire. To say that the word combustion means fire is to say that people use that word to mean fire. Furthermore, there is no ordinary sense of the word mean in which a picture of a man means a man or means that man. This suggests that Peirce's theory of size would comprise at least three rather different subjects: a theory of the intended meaning, a theory of evidence, and the theory of pictorial depiction. There is no reason to think that these theories must contain common principles. I was convinced that Harman was wrong, and I objected that his argument clashed, first of all, with linguistic usage. Why have people used the word sign for more than 2,000 years to define phenomena that should be divided into three different categories? Second, Harman's objection goes against the consensus gentium of the philosophical tradition. From the Stoics to the Middle Ages, and from Locke to Peirce, from Husserl to Wittgenstein, there has been a constant attempt to find a common basis for the theory of linguistic meaning and for the theory of pictorial depiction, and also for the theory of meaning and the theory of inference. When we examine the problem of the Stoic semeion, we will see how ambiguous and inextricable the relationship is between a fact, from which many consequences can be inferred, the proposition that represents it, and the sentence that expresses that proposition. In any event, what makes these problems difficult to separate is precisely the fact that in every case, aliquid stat pro aliquo. The manner of standing for may vary, yet we still face a peculiar dialectics of presence and absence. It is not a good enough reason to ask whether a common mechanism, however deep, might govern both phenomena. Even though I dealt with the specific semiotics in various written works, for instance, apropos of narratology. My basic interest has always been in general semiotics, and I hold that general semiotics is a form of philosophy, perhaps the only form of philosophy permissible today. And in this I share the idea that contemporary philosophy has been characterized by a linguistic turn. On this slide, I thought in the Second Congress, Vienna, 1959, in this line of thought, in the Second Congress, held in Vienna, 59, I launched an appeal for the studies in the history of semiotics. And after that event, many important researches on the historical roots of our discipline were fruitfully developed. Many other congresses followed every 5 years, and I began to realize that the ideas of general semiotics were in minority compared to the various studies on specific semiotics. In addition, in the 70s, many scholars were shifting their attention from the fundamentals, the nature of the sign, the signified, and iconic resemblance, to an analysis of texts. This was a most productive period, but my impression was that after having worked out a series of analytical instruments, the business of applying them to texts ran the risk of finding the same mechanism in every one. Think of the suggestions made by the Russian formalists, also the theories of narratology. I held that after Greimas and Genet theories of narrative texts, every textual analysis seemed to appear as a mere tautology. In other words, whether one was analyzing Tolstoy or a detective story, it was always possible to identify the mechanism brought to light by narratology. In the sense in which the analysis of a tragedy can only highlight the narrative devices explained in Aristotle's Poetics. But this was not my whimsical opinion, which came very late. I found recently in Roland Barthes' SZ, 1970, this remark. There are said to be certain Buddhists whose ascetic practices enable them to see a whole landscape in a being. Precisely what the first analysts of narrative were attempting, to see all the world's stories, and there have been ever so many, with a single structure. We shall, they thought, extract from each tale its model. Then out of these models we shall make a great narrative structure, which we shall reapply for verification to anyone's narrative. A task as exhausting, 90% perspiration, as the saying goes, as it is ultimately undesirable, for the text thereby loses its difference. What many people were losing sight of was the philosophical basis of semiotics. I realized this many years later when I took part in the International Congress held at the University of California, Berkeley, in '94. To quote only a few items, not of speeches but of sections, there were sessions of meta-theory, artificial intelligence, cognitive science, analysis of political discourses, temporality, Japanese pragmatics, semiotics of silence, semiotics of death, cyberspace, legal semiotics, media, body, religion, marketing, calligraphy, humor, education, sign processing, human-computer interaction, postmodern library and information science, older sexuality, analysis of the Cold War, medical semiotics, and even symmetry in crystallography. Clearly, This program mirrored the coexistence of a plurality of interests, say, more diverse topics. Not having followed all the meetings, I cannot say if there were common criteria for investigating both the semiotics of death and symmetry in crystallography. I think the organizers' purpose was not to provide and to impose a unified theoretical framework, but rather to take account of a variety of subject matter and the theoretical approaches. I also think that the choice of the topics was due to geographical accidents, and I suspect that there was Japanese pragmatics and not Eskimo semantics because the Congress took place on the Pacific coast and not in the Arctic Circle. However, all these scholars certainly believed that there were family resemblances between so many disconnected interests and methods, as if they were trying to produce a new Diderot's encyclopedia, which considered together the Gobelin tapestry and God, Egyptian hieroglyphs and windmills. Can still we speak at this point of a discipline, or should we accept the idea that we are not so much interested in discovering a unified semiotic approach, but in browsing through the semiotic web? Thus, I became more and more convinced that semiotics is not the name of a single science or discipline, but rather that of a department or school, just as there is no single science called medicine, but instead schools of medicine, in the academic sense of the expression. In a school of medicine, we have surgery, biochemistry, dietetics, immunology, psychiatry, and so on, something, even acupuncture and homeopathy. In such a school, experts in a given branch tend more and more not to understand the purpose and the language of other specialists, but in spite of such discrepancies, they can all work together because they have a common object, the human body, and the common purpose is its health. Semiotics is perhaps something similar, a field in which different approaches have, at a higher level of generality, a common object, semiosis. I don't know if there are cases of semiosis in crystallography, but there certainly are instances of semiosis even in the decision to keep silent in order to express perplexity or to refuse to agree with a given opinion. The only problem is how to define semiosis and to provide criteria for identifying it every time it shows up. This remains the purpose of a general semiotics. And I do not think that one can study Japanese pragmatics without entertaining a rigorous and philosophical concept of semiosis. What can be the future of semiotics? Semioticians are perhaps able to analyze prophetic texts, but are not prophets themselves. They don't rank Nostradamus among their founding fathers. However, the question is not a whimsical one. Every discipline is subject to historical changes, and the paths it takes are always motivated by the will, I would say the duty, to react to some phenomena typical of a given cultural moment. As far as semiotics is concerned, its first problem was with Parmenides, to distinguish between the reliability of semata, or natural science, and the unreliability of onomata, that is, words. Aristotle approached the semiotic phenomena by distinguishing between sounds, things, and pathemata, the psyches, that is the mental image, or the idea that verbal sounds activate in our mind. This also happened because Greek culture was ascertaining the existence of barbarians, of people who at first glance had no language at all, but in fact were able to designate the things by words, by their own words. The same idea was worked out more finally by the Stoics. It was by chance that they were originally Phoenicians, that these bilingual thinkers, perfectly aware of the fact that in different countries the same thoughts are meant by different words. Romans were so steadily convinced that their Latin was the only viable language, they did not elaborate the semiotics of their own, except for a theory of translation, since they had to absorb and emulate the Greek heritage. And rhetoric, indispensable for their legal and political purposes. Medieval schoolmen were not concerned with languages other than Latin. Before them, Augustine had started a very complex theory and practice of biblical hermeneutics, but without knowing Hebrew and with a vague, if not null, knowledge of Greek. Their semiotic contribution mostly concerned two items which were crucial for their cultural purpose, namely textual interpretation, that is the hermeneutics of the Bible, and the relationship between words and universals. Only from Roger Bacon to Occam, in a new cultural climate, become very sensitive, the Middle Age, to natural experience, and they switched to the study of relationship between signa and res, and between a true proposition and what was the case. In the 17th century, the word semiotics reappeared, centuries after Galen, and not only in Locke, to designate a doctrine of science, also because only at that moment the European culture became fully aware of the existence of other culture and other forms of writing, from the Chinese ideograms to the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Between 19th and 20th century, we had finally Charles Sanders Peirce and Ferdinand de Saussure, even though Peirce remained at this time an isolated vox clamantis in deserto. Then semiotics became a more and more certain topic in the 20th century. Remember that even in the framework of the Encyclopedia of Unified Science, spoke of semiotics, Carnap, and Morris. And step by step, we arrived to the semiotic boom of the mid-century, because it was in our century that communication became a heavy industry, started his mythology to analyze different phenomena of communication in everyday life. Semiotic recognized itself as an unavoidable endeavor at the moment in which, at least in developed countries, it was clear that one can take the power not by putting his tanks on the street, but by seizing radio and TV, so that communication became a heavy industry. Semiotics has become a sort of moral critical duty when it was clear that mass media were the new sacred texts which produced ideology and changed our perception of the real world. Which phenomena will the semiotics of tomorrow face? In an era of globalization in which a different society will have the same technology and the same habits, probably the semiotic research will have to deal with many contemporary phenomena more or less linked to the pervasive presence of the global semiotic web. For certain scholars, see for example the present school of Tartu, semiotics has to broaden his inquiry to the kingdom of non-human and biological communication. But my personal concern is still about the development of a general semiotics. One of my amusement is to visit every year the American bookstore and to see how they change the classification of the semiotic stuff. In the 60s, the books on semiotics appeared in the shelves devoted to Marxism, psychoanalysis, and phenomenology. In the 70s, I found them under structuralism, along with Marxism, cinema, and feminism. Then they traveled from post-structuralism to postmodern and cultural studies. But it happened to me to find St. Augustine in the shelf of New Age. In the course of my explorations, I, however, was delighted in discovering, decades ago, that the Harvard bookstore set up a big and special room which included artificial intelligence, brain science, logic and analytical philosophy, psychology of perception, linguistics and semiotics, all together under the headings of cognitive science. No one has ever claimed that the cognitive sciences are a single science, and everyone is in agreement about maintaining them as a sort of interdisciplinary aggregate with a common nucleus. And it doesn't displease me that semiotics has come to be included in this confederation, independently of the question still debated, whether semiotics is a cognitive science or cognitive science are a branch of the general semiotics, as once the late Thomas Sebeok claimed. Semiosis has become a central concept of our contemporary scientific paradigm, as the opposition between res extensa and res cogitans in the 17th century. And it is certain that many disciplines can derive inspiration from semiotic concepts without necessarily being asemiotics. I have stressed the link between semiotics and cognitive science, and someone can object that there are many semiotic researchers which are not strictly connected with cognition, such as, let me say, analysis of literary text, researches on the effect of mass media, social and cultural semiotics, and especially that fruitful and still in progress field of studies concerning translation. However, I think that one of the main duties of semiotics research must remain its cognitive orientation. It is not a question of being a la mode. Since a long time, Persian scholars have spoken of Peirce semiotics as a cognitive semiotics. So please stick to the fundamental ideas of our forerunners. The semiotics of the middle of the last century, I think, for instance, of the French structuralists, insisted in demonstrating that our experience of the world is mediated by text, and texts are not a mirror-like representation of the world, but an interpretation of it as it turned to be interpreted by their addressee. In this textual turn, it was rediscovered Peirce's notion of unlimited semiosis. I want to make clear that I consider such an endeavor extremely productive. It helped us to recognize how much our allegedly naive experience was determined by discursive strategy. It was in such a perspective that we insisted so much on the duty of studying not the referential relationship between sign and things, but rather, or at least first of all, the semantic relationship between signs and meaning, or between signs and their interpretants. But we cannot deny that those approaches also produced the illusion that there was no more world at all, but only texts, and that semiosis was a continual and infinite deferral from sign to sign and from text to text. I think not so much of Derrida as of a sort of savage American version of the idea of deconstruction that I once defined as a Native American merchandise produced on French license. I want to staunchly remember that there is a radical difference between the deconstructive drift and the Persian notion of unlimited semiosis. In the second chapter of his grammatology, Derrida looks for authorities able to legitimize his attempt to outline a semiosis of infinite play and of the infinite world of interpretation. And among the authors he quotes after Saussure and Jacobson, there is also Peirce. Allow me this long quote. Peirce goes very far in the direction that I have called the deconstruction of the transcendental signified, which at one time or another would place a reassuring end to the reference from sign to sign. I have identified logocentrism and the metaphysics of presence as the exigent, powerful, systematic, and the irrepressible desire for such a signified. Now, Peirce considers the indefiniteness of reference as the criterion that allows us to recognize that we are indeed dealing with a system of signs. What broaches the movement of signification is what makes its interruption impossible. The thing itself is a sign. The so-called thing itself is always already a representamen shielded from the simplicity of intuitive evidence. The representamen functions only by giving rise to an interpreter that itself becomes a sign, and so on to infinity. The self-identity of the signified conceals itself unceasingly, and it's always on the move. The represented is already a representamen. From the moment that there is meaning, there are nothing but signs. End of my quote. The limit of this reading of Peirce is that Derrida didn't take into account the fact that Peirce doesn't stop here. It is true that Peirce speaks of a possible infinite interpretation, but for Peirce, the idea of meaning is such as to involve some reference to a purpose. A purpose is, without any shade of doubt, and at least in the Peircean framework, connected with something which lies outside semiosis. Maybe it has nothing to do with the transcendental subject, but it has to do with reference. When Peirce provides its famous definition of lithium as a packet of instruction aimed at permitting not only the identification but also the production of a specimen of lithium, he remarks the peculiarity of his definition is that it tells you what the word lithium denotes by prescribing what you are to do in order to gain a perceptive acquaintance with the object of the world. Every semiosic act is for Peirce determined by a dynamical object, which is the reality which by some means contrives to determine the sign to its representamen. We produce representamens, that is interpretation, because we are compelled by something external to the circuit of semiosis. It is true that for Peirce the dynamical object can never be attained in its actual individual identity, but it is known only through the immediate object, and it is the immediate object which becomes the starting point for further interpretation. If perception is, as it is for Peirce, semiosis, that even at the original moment of our perceptive acquaintance with the external world, the external world becomes understandable to us only under the form of the immediate object, which is an interpreting phenomenon. For Peirce, when the sign is produced, the dynamical object is no more there. And before the sign were produced, it was not an object at all. But the presence of the representamen, as well as the present in the mind or elsewhere of the immediate object, means that in some way the dynamical object, which is not there, was somewhere. Being no present or not being there, the object of an act of interpretation has been. Moreover, the dynamical object that was and which is absent in the ghost of the immediate one, can to be translated into the potentially infinite chain of its interpretation, will be or ought to be, says Peirce, an endless series of representations, each representing the one behind it, may be conceived to have an absolute object as its limit. Here appears something that cannot find a place within the constructive framework. Outside the immediate interpreter, the emotional, the energetic, and the logical one, all internal to the course of semiosis, there is, for Peirce, a final logical interpreter that is the habit. And the habit is a disposition to act upon the world, and this possibility to act, as well as the recognition of this possibility as a law, requests something which is very close to a transcendental instance, a community, as an intersubjective guarantee of a non-intuitive, non-naively realistic, but rather conjectural notion of truth. There is a real perfection of knowledge by which reality is constituted. For the pragmatic maxim, the meaning of any proposition is nothing more than the conceivable practical effects which the assertion would imply if the proposition were true. Then the process of interpretation must stop, at least for some time, out of language, at least in the sense in which not every practical effect is a semiotic one. It is true that even the practical effect might then to be spelled out by and through interpreters, and that the very agreement among the members of the community cannot but take the form of a new chain of signs. Nevertheless, the agreement concerns something, be it practical effect or the possibility of a practical effect, that is produced outside semiosis. There is something for Peirce that transcends the individual intention of the interpreter, and it is the idea of a community as a transcendental principle. This principle is not transcendental in the Kantian sense because it doesn't come before but after the semiotic process. It is not the structure of human mind that produced the interpretation, but the reality that semiosis builds up. Anyway, from the moment in which the community is pulled to agree with a given interpretation, there is, if not an objective, at least an intersubjective meaning which acquires a privilege over any other possible interpretation spelled out without the agreement of the community. Peirce once said that there is a true conclusion of semiosis, and it is reality. The problem of interpretation, which can be studied theoretically only by a general semiotics, is fundamental in order to face many philosophical positions according to which there are no facts but only interpretation. A typical Nietzschean legacy, even though Nietzsche added that even his defense of interpretation against facts was itself an interpretation. Today, an appeal to a new realism was advocated, and within this framework, a general semiotics has something to say. Personally, I developed the idea of a negative realism, by which there are brute facts that challenge some of our interpretation and say that we cannot entertain them. Semiotics can also play a role in one of the main issues of our time, the education of young people about how to surf in the web. Once I was looking into the web for some information about Calcedonia. I don't remember why. From Calcedonia, I was sent, I don't remember what, a series of other fascinating links to the first English translation of the Rosicrucian Fama. A link in the commentary sent me to innumerable sites on the realm of Prester John. And from these I surfed until an impressive series of documents on the 10 lost tribes of Israel. I frantically saved and printed a lot of curious documents, but more or less at 2 o'clock in the night or in the morning, I felt stoned and I switched my computer off. At that moment, I realized that I had forgot my original purpose in starting the research. In a continual deferral from text to text, I had lost the opportunity to produce the habit which would have allowed me to pick up what I originally wanted. This is a nice parable. thing, which tells us two important things. First of all, that in the semiotic virtuality of the web, a very deconstructive creature indeed, we risk to lose every idea of purpose and of action. Secondly, that one of the duties of semiotics in the next millennium, will probably be to teach people not only how to use science to serve the infinite ocean of semiosis, but also how to return, not forever, but always at every stage of our semiotics interrogation, to the dynamical object. Maybe there are other interesting perspectives in the future of semiotics, but at this moment I don't remember that. Sorry.